Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I have a little bit of a different video for you. As some of you may know, if you have been following the channel for a while, I did a video last year, I think it was last year, about recording what you read and how you read, whether people write lists of the books, keep spreadsheets, have a reading journal, all the different ways we can look at and track what we read. And in that video, I had told everybody that I actually began tracking my own reading just with a simple list of all of the books read in a particular year in 2012. So it had been 10 years last year that I had tracked everything that I had read. And so I have a decade of books written down in the exact order that I have read them. Obviously, things like Goodreads have helped me track the books that I have read over my lifetime, and I go in and I have thrown in books that I read, in my teenage years, and it's kind of like a haphazard pile that's just been put together. But in terms of knowing exactly what I read, how many stars I gave that book, whether it was the first time or a reread, etc., 2012 is when I started tracking that information. And a topic that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I think it's just from being on BookTube, because this is a topic that comes up fairly often. There's been some really good discussions from people like Alan over at the Library of Alexandria about star ratings, how we rate a book, how we read books, why we give books the ratings that we do, and what that means. Like, what is the longevity in that? And that is what I wanted to talk about today and what I wanted to think about today. So I was curious and I wanted to go back and look at my 5-star reads from 2012 and my 5-star reads from 2022. So I chose 2012 instead of 2013, which I guess is 10 years from this year, because I just wanted to look at the numbers, first of all, and see were there comparable numbers of 5-star reads in both years, what the distribution of those 5-star reads were, what sorts of books did I give 5 stars 10 years ago versus last year. And it was really interesting. I had thought about this last year because there are certainly some books that I've even read since I joined BookTube that I know I gave 5 stars in the moment. And what usually led to that decision was the ending of a book. I am someone who is very caught up in the ending of a book. If your book has an explosive ending where there's lots happening, there's huge reveals or giant fights, or there's a lot of emotion near the end, like the back end of a book, even if I haven't super enjoyed the beginning or the middle, I will sometimes be so caught up in the excitement that it will definitely get a 5-star from me. And some of those books have longevity. Some of them I continue to think of very fondly. I think of a lot. They stick with me. And some of them disappear fairly quickly. And so I wonder, was that really a 5-star read? Because to me, a 5-star read is the kind of book that's going to stick with you for 10 years. And so that's why I wanted to go back and look at the books from 10 years ago, because I'm going to talk about them and see if they are still books that I think about a lot, that I have reread in the past 10 years, that have the details are still very clear in my mind, that I still remember the emotions I felt while I was reading them. And do I think I would still give them 5 stars if I was reading them right now? So we are going to just compare a few stats between 2012 and 2022. Then we're going to take a look down through the 2012 list. And obviously I need a sheet of notes for this because I can't remember all of those books off the top of my head. Maybe a younger Sarah could have, but this post-children Sarah does not have that brain capacity. So in 2012, the number of books that I read between the 2 years was very similar. So in 2012, I read 117 books. In 2022, I only wrote down the number of new books. I think last year I read 121 or 119. I don't remember how many it was exactly, but the number of new books, because I'm only counting new 5 stars on this list. In 2012, I read 102 new books. I was a bigger rereader in the past than I am now. And in 2022, I read 116 new books. And the 5-star distribution went. In 2012, I gave 5 stars to 27 books, which made about 26% of the books that I read were 5-star reads. In 2022, I gave 21 books 5 stars, which was 18% of what I read. And that has been more consistent over the last couple of years. If I look back just at like 2022, 2019, about 20%, either a little bit below or a little bit above, seems to be the like usual number of 5-star reads that I have. So about a fifth of the books that I read end up being 5 stars, which I think is pretty reasonable. 5 stars to me does not necessarily have to mean a perfect book. It is just a book that is perfect for me. So having about 20% of the things that I read seems like I'm good with that. In terms of genre breakdown, this is where we start to see like a big variation between 2012 reading Sarah and 2022 reading Sarah. So in 2012, the genre that received the most number of 5-star reads from me was graphic novels or comic books. And they were mostly comic books because I tend to think of comic books as like serialized superhero type stories and graphic novels as more like independent stories that are either created on their own or they're, I guess, more like novelizations in graphic format. I don't know if that is like the true definition of a graphic novel versus a comic book or if people use them interchangeably, but that's how I kind of separate them in my mind. So most of my 5-star reads were actually comic books. So 10 of the 27 were comic books. Then we had 7 YA fantasy, which that's 7 5-star YA fantasy. I read a lot of YA fantasy in 2012. I don't think I've read 7 YA fantasy, like if you added them all up from the last couple of years combined. So that is a huge change. I gave 5 stars to 6 adult fantasy in 2012. And I was still reading a little bit of adult fantasy. Like I've never stopped reading adult fantasy. It's just that I had moved away from it a lot and was reading a lot more other things. Whereas for the last couple of years, like 80% of what I read has been adult fantasy. After that, we had 2 just contemporary works of fiction and 2 contemporary YA works of fiction. And then if we look at last year's, and I'm not going to go through all of last year's 5-star books because it was just last year. If you've been sticking around in the channel, you know which ones were given 5 stars. But of the 21 last year, 13 of them were adult fantasy. And nothing else comes close. Then it's like a pretty scattered distribution. So we had 13 adult fantasy, 1 volume of manga, 1 romance, 2 works of nonfiction, 2 works of historical fiction, 1 sci-fi, and 1 classic. So a much larger like distribution, but a like way bigger gap between the adult fantasy and anything else in 2022. So who knows, maybe 10 years from now, I'll go back and look at this again and be equally fascinated by the results. But I wanted to just walk through the books that I had given 5 stars in 2012 and see how I feel about them. And I'm just going to separate them by genre. So we'll obviously start with the adult fantasy since that is what I read the most of. And the first book is A Clash of Kings. So I guess the first time that I read A Clash of Kings was in 2012, and I gave it 5 stars. I've only read the first 3 Song of Ice and Fire books because I was just trying to shield my heart from not having the rest of them. And I thought that after book 3 was a good place to take a pause. I will probably go back and read 4 and 5, even without the release of 6 or 7. It's just that at the time that I read them, I thought, okay, this seems like a reasonable place to stop. But A Clash of Kings, this absolutely is a 5-star book. I know that if I read it again right now, I would still want to give it 5 stars. If I were reading it for the first time right now, I would still want to give it 5 stars. I think that George R.R. Martin has excellent command of language. His dialogue is excellent. He does multi-POVs in a way that is incredibly compelling. You are always interested, or at least I am always interested, in the character that I'm following. And it's just one of those benchmarks of the genre for a reason. It is a book that influenced tons of people who are writing right now. And I think that it is going to continue to be a classic, continue to be a staple in the genre, even if the series is never completed. After that, and these ones are, I'm trying to determine if I would still give them 5 stars, but I'm opening myself up to some ridicule, I know, from other fantasy readers or fantasy booktubers. But the next 3 books that I gave 5 stars to all of them was the Night Angel trilogy by Brent Weeks. So that would be The Way of Shadows, Shadow's Edge, and Beyond the Shadows. This is a very angsty, it's kind of like a crossover fantasy book, to be honest. Like there are some young adult elements, but it is very much an adult book in terms of subject matter and scope and level of violence, etc. But the character starts off as a teenager at least, and he may age up to like a young adult in the book. It's been 10 years. I don't remember everything, but there's at least like a portion of his young life that is in the first book for sure. But these are like angsty, dark kind of assassin fantasy. And at the time, I ripped through them. Like I read these in very quick sequence. I remember them being incredibly readable, very fast paced. I also enjoy a good like angsty, over the top assassin story. Like I love Throne of Glass. I liked these books. I enjoyed Nevernight when I read it. Like I enjoy the fun and the camp that comes along with that genre. Would I give this 5 stars now? I don't remember everything about it. There are bits and flashes from each book that I remember. There are certainly some highs and lows that I can remember. I wonder if the treatment of female characters would bother me more now. I don't think so. I think I was a lot more intense about my dislike of certain tropes and the way that characters, especially female characters, were written 10 years ago. I was a lot more fiery back then. So I don't know. I've read a lot more modern adult fantasy. I can't imagine that these would be near the top of my favorite books, but part of me actually wants to go back and reread them to see what I would think of them. Maybe I just didn't care as much what anybody else thought back then. Maybe I was like, you know what? I'm going to give all these Brent Weeks books 5 stars and I don't care who thinks that that's fine or not fine. I don't know if I would like bend to the pressures of common consensus, because I think at least most people believe that these books are pretty bad. Maybe I'm just making that up, but I don't think they're incredibly popular. I do remember having a lot of fun. I now want to know if I would like them as much as I did back then. And I think part of this at least had to be that I wasn't reading a lot of adult fantasy. So when I did read something that was adult fantasy, I was like, yes, like give me more. And also, I do love a good fast-paced fantasy book. When something is so incredibly readable, it makes me feel like I'm enjoying it because I'm going through it so quickly. So sometimes I think there's that like false sense of this must be really good because I'm reading it so fast, when in reality, there are some books that are just paced incredibly well and they're very easy to get through. So the jury is out. I don't think I would end up giving all of these books 5 stars if I read them again or if I was reading them for the first time now, but in 2012, they were all 5-star books. After that, we have a couple of my favorites that I read for the first time in 2012. So the first one is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This is a very divisive book on BookTube and I think just in the greater reading world. It is an adult fantasy novel that has mainstream appeal. So people who don't read fantasy, like my mother-in-law, for example, love The Night Circus. There's just enough magic, just enough of a whimsical atmosphere for people who are into more like traditional book club type selections, which is certainly the kind of reader that my mother-in-law is. There are things about The Night Circus that I think appeal to those types of readers really well. So it has that kind of wide-reaching appeal. But I also just really love it. I love the more epic fantasy. I love the more like traditional or classic fantasy, but I also really love The Night Circus. This is one of the like bright points in mine and Patrick's friendship, because he hates this book so much and I love reminding him of how much I like it. So that always makes me really happy, because the amount of love that I have for The Night Circus is equal to the amount of hate that Patrick has for The Night Circus. But this is, I've heard people describe this as like just all vibes, like it runs just on vibes, which it's true. This is a very atmospheric book. It is going to rely on your sense of immersion and your sense of setting and whether or not you can envision the book and feel yourself in the book. The plot, the characterization are both very light, but it is really immersive. I love the writing. I just get lost in it. I've read it I think 2 times. I read it in 2012, and then I read it a few years ago and thought, nope, I still really love this. And I'll probably read it again sometime soon. Evie was very kind and sent me a special edition of this book that she had ordered, and it is beautiful and is making me want to reread it. So perhaps there will be a reread of The Night Circus coming up sometime soon. But that absolutely earned its 5 stars. I still think about it all the time. It is still one of my favorite standalone fantasy books, and I think it will continue to be for, a very long time. And the last adult fantasy book that I have on the 2012 list is The Song of Achilles. The Song of Achilles is very, very, very popular now. It became very popular on Book Talk. Almost everyone has read it. It drove this kind of huge resurgence in Greek retellings and just mythological retellings in general. And I think some people are very tired of hearing of The Song of Achilles, which is sad. I am not at all a book hipster. I am not at all I want people to read the books that I love because I want to talk about them. But part of The Song of Achilles' popularity has made me a little bit sad because I think when anything reaches that kind of height of popularity, there's automatically going to be this wave of it is trash that comes in behind. And I don't think it's trash. I think it's a 5-star book. It is one of my most reread books. I think if I read it 10 years ago, I think I've reread it 8 times. I don't think I'm at 10 times in 10 years yet, but I have read it many, many times, and I am probably due for a reread of that one as well. But I really love the writing. I love the storytelling. I just think it's a beautiful book, and I will continue to love it for many, many years. After the adult fantasy, we are going to flip over into YA fantasy. And there are 7 works of YA fantasy that made it on to this list. And I will do the first 2 together because they are in a series together. So those are Daughter of Smoke and Bone and Days of Blood and Starlight, which are the first 2 books in the Daughter of Smoke and Bone series. I actually read Daughter of Smoke and Bone for the first time in 2012, and then when I was looking at this list, I reread it in 2012. So I read it twice in the same year. That tells you how much I enjoyed it. I guess I read it, and then when the second one was going to come out, I probably reread it again in anticipation of reading the second one. But this is a YA book that I actually held off on for a while. I'm not sure what year it came out, but I imagine it was at least the year before, maybe even 2 years before. And I hadn't read it because I thought it was about angels. And it kind of is. There is an angel-esque character who is in the book, but I was not really into angels. That sub-genre of paranormal romance or that branch of paranormal romance did not appeal to me in any way. And funnily enough, I saw a review by Patrick Rothfuss on Goodreads where he was talking about how beautiful this book was, how gorgeous the writing was, and how he wished that he had written some of the phrases that were in it. And I was like, whoa, Patrick Rothfuss has some of the best writing that I have ever seen. So if he is admiring this book, then maybe I should check it out. And I read it, and it was so, so good. This is a YA fantasy, but definitely at the older end of YA. And it does follow an angel-esque character, and then also another character who really I shouldn't even tell you anything about it because there is fun in discovering what this book is about. All I will say is that the writing is genuinely beautiful, but it borders on that kind of purple prose style. So there is a lot of it's very heavy on the poetic language. So it will either work for you or it won't. I don't think there's a lot of in between. I personally really like it. The magic that is used in this book is so cool. And I don't want to say anything else about it because it is so unique and so different and not at all what I was expecting when I picked it up, but it is very cool. I will say that there's an element of wishing that is involved with the magic system, which is super cool. And it really fits the dream, fairy tale-esque aesthetic that Laini Taylor has going on in these books. But this series it remains one of my favorite YA series. I love the series. I love the first 2 books in particular. The third book is still excellent, but I think tried to incorporate a few too many things. There was some extra information that came in at the end when I think we probably should have just wrapped up the story that we had instead of introducing new elements into it at the end of the trilogy. But these 2 books are phenomenal. I really love them. They would absolutely still be 5 stars if I was reading them for the first time now. After that, we have The Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater. Maggie Stiefvater wrote The Raven Cycle, which is another one of my favorite YA series, and she's another author that I think has particularly beautiful prose. I think she's an excellent writer, and I really liked The Scorpio Races. This is a standalone, And it's dual POV, so it follows a young girl and a boy who are involved in a race called the Scorpio races. And what they race are these mythological horses that come out of the ocean, and they are cannibalistic horses. So you have to tame them and then ride them in a race. So it's a really dangerous race because people are getting eaten. If you get thrown off one of these horses, they could trample you or kill you themselves, drag you back into the ocean and eat you. Like, there's definitely some threads of horror that run through this book as well, but it's very fast paced, very exciting, and I really, really enjoyed it when I read it. I have never gone back to reread it, but I probably would. I think that it definitely earned its 5-star status. This is one of my middle sister's favorite books ever. She has multiple copies of it. She's read it a bunch of times. And I do think that it is really good, especially if you are a horse person or a mythology person. So if you have not read it and you like YA fantasy, this is an older one that I think is very much worthwhile. After that, we have Bitter Blue, which is part of the Graceling series by Kristin Cashore. And I actually have reread this one recently because she started releasing new books in the Graceling realms after a break of about 10 years. And so I went back and reread the initial books, including Bitter Blue, and I still really love them. This is another one of my favorite YA fantasy series, and Bitter Blue in particular is really good, and I think was really progressive for its time. It explored topics that you did not see a lot in YA fantasy. Like, you see these topics a lot in YA, like contemporary YA novels, but it talks about self-harm and trauma and suicide and some really heavy topics within a fantasy setting. And there's magic that's kind of threaded through that. And it stands out to me for some of those reasons. I think that Kristin Cashore was tackling topics that were ahead of her time when she was writing her YA novels, and she just does a phenomenal job with them. So Bitter Blue, I think, still maintains its 5-star rating. After that, we have the book Unspoken by Sarah Rees Brennan. I remember almost nothing about this book. I don't even remember liking it that much. I don't know why I gave this 5 stars. I don't even know what to tell you about it. I don't imagine that I would give it 5 stars now, and it did not really live up to its 5-star rating because it has completely evaporated from my mind. I don't even think I own it anymore, so it's funny that I gave it 5 stars and I didn't even hold on to it, but that's the way that it goes sometimes. After that, we have Howl's Moving Castles. This was the first time that I had read the book version of Howl's Moving Castle, and I probably still would give this 5 stars, but to be honest, I don't really remember the difference between the book and the movie. I remember loving the book. I have watched the movie tons of times and I love the movie. So it might be also time for Howl's Moving Castle reread. I would love to do a month of Diana Wynne Jones, actually. Maybe I will try to do that sometime this year. Maybe do some reading vlogs, talk about Diana Wynne Jones's bibliography, where to start, what to read. But I think that Howl's Moving Castle probably deserves a reread at some point, but I'm going to say that it also deserved its 5-star rating. The very last YA fantasy novel is the book Chime by Franny Billingsley. This is a book that even when I was reading it, I was so caught up in the atmosphere and in the writing. I believe it won the National Book Award for YA fiction. I'm not sure. It was at least nominated or maybe won. I don't remember, but I picked it up from like one of those award tables at the bookstore, and it was a total impulse buy. And I ended up loving it. I still think about it. And this is one that I would definitely love to reread because I want to know, it holds such a weird, like dreamy kind of place in my mind. And I would like to reread it to see how I feel about it now. But I think based on how I still think about it, I think that it deserved its 5 stars. After that, we have a bunch of comics. I'm not going to go through all of these. I will say that Avengers Disassembled was on there. 2012 was obviously the release of the first Avengers movie in the MCU. It was Avengers Mania for anybody who was into Marvel and into comic books, which I was. So I read that around the same time that I went to Comic-Con. Then we had Iron Man Extremis, and this was the comic that some of the plot for Iron Man 3 came from. So I read that again around like Comic-Con time in 2012 and really enjoyed it. Then there are a bunch of volumes from Matt Fraction's run on The Invincible Iron Man, which I really enjoyed. Some of them were 5 stars, some of them were not. I'm not going to go through all of the different volumes, but I did enjoy his tenure with Iron Man, and I did really enjoy those stories. So a bunch of those got 5 stars. Then we had Runaways. So there was one volume called The Good Die Young, which might be like the third Runaways volume. I'm not sure. Runaways was kind of like the YA Marvel comic. It was about a bunch of young superheroes or like children of superheroes or children of villains that all got together and, you know, got up to shenanigans. So I did really enjoy the Runaways series when I read that, and this was the one randomly. I don't remember what about this one gave it 5 stars as opposed to all of the others, but I did really like the series when I was reading it. Then we have The Battle of Jericho Hill, which is the last volume of the first 5 Gunslinger graphic novels, I think. I did really enjoy all of them. When I was looking back through, I think I gave them all 4 stars, but then this final one I gave 5 stars. I really like the Dark Tower comics. They're really fun. I enjoy the artwork. It was nice to read through them all. If you're a big Dark Tower fan, then I do recommend them. I will continue some point this year reading through the Dark Tower novels, and then when I get to the end, I will probably reread these graphic novels as well. And then the last one was a standalone by Joss Whedon, which is called Frey, which is set in the future of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer universe. And if you like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and you like Joss Whedon's style of storytelling, you would probably enjoy the Frey comic book. If you are used to Buffy and the kind of setup and the execution, you might know what's going to happen in the comic before it happens. So there might not be any big surprises, but I still found it really enjoyable. The character of Frey is really, really cool too. So I did enjoy that one a lot. Then after that, we've got our 2 contemporary books that got 5 stars. So one was The Kite Runner. I've talked about The Kite Runner on the channel before in like the most traumatizing books that I've ever read video. And Kite Runner earned all of those stars. It probably earned an extra star, but as I have previously said on this channel, I will never, ever reread it. It left me so sad for so long. All right, I've clearly been talking for too long because I had to take a break to cough, but The Kite Runner, very, very sad. I can't imagine what it would take to get me to reread that book, even though I really, really loved it when I read it. If you like historical fiction and you don't mind having your heart ripped from your chest, then I absolutely recommend The Kite Runner. It is an excellent story, but I can't imagine what kind of scenario would ever get me to reread that one. It earns all of its stars, though, very, very easily. The other work of contemporary fiction that got a 5 stars in 2012 was Fight Club. And actually, I had never seen the movie Fight Club. I read the book before I saw the movie, and I was lucky enough to make it that far into my life without knowing anything about it. So people take the you don't talk about Fight Club rule seriously, I guess. And I really, really enjoyed it. It's the kind of book that I think is most enjoyable on its first read. I don't know if rereading it would give it 5 stars or not, because it's just one of those books that is so good the first time you read it, and I really enjoyed it. I read the book and then watched the movie, and I was happy with that order of doing things. And then for our final 2 is just our contemporary YA books. The first one is The Fault in Our Stars, the book that every girl between the age of 15 and 25 gave 5 stars in 2012. But, that was the height of John Greenedness. And I really did like his books. I enjoyed his YA stories. I think his very first one, Looking for Alaska, is probably my favorite of all of them. But I did like The Fault in Our Stars. I don't think the reader that I am right now would necessarily think that The Fault in Our Stars is a 5-star book. But I did enjoy it at the time. It was sad. It was emotional. But I don't know that it would be 5 stars for me now. And then the very last one is a book called Why We Broke Up by Daniel Handler, who's actually Lemony Snicket, the guy who wrote the Series of Unfortunate Events series. But this was a library book that I grabbed when I was on rotation. So I was doing like a rural medicine rotation. So I was in a small town, and they randomly had this on the YA shelf at their local library. So I picked it up and read it while I was out of town studying. And I really liked it. It is a YA book about a breakup. But it's not about like the drama of a breakup or anything like that. At the beginning of the story, the girl, brings a box of things back to the guy that she has been dating, kind of like drops it on his steps. And the book is a novel, but also a novel with illustrations that brings you through each of these items, and I think might go back through their relationship either like in reverse order, or it might go from the beginning of their relationship up to why they broke up. But it is told through all of these objects and what they meant to the person and what they symbolized and why they were giving it back. And on the back, instead of blurbs, it has a bunch of breakup stories from a bunch of famous authors. And it was just really well put together, from the illustrations to the blurbs to the writing to just the story in general. It's a really unique contemporary story, and something I think that's relatable for almost everybody. Obviously, there are some people who are not interested in dating, and there are some people who date one person and then they stay with that person forever, so they don't have experience with breakups. But for anybody who has been through that, especially as a teenager, because if you know, if you were in that experience yourself, teenage breakups can be very emotionally, and then a lot of emotions can run high at that time. And we ascribe a lot of value to things that might seem, silly in retrospect, but I think that it is a very relatable book. It is something that will always be relatable as long as people are having relationships with each other. And I think that it was worth the 5 stars. This is one that I could recommend to teenagers far into the future, and will probably recommend to my kids when they are old enough to have some of those experiences for themselves for the first time. But it was a really cool book. I would probably buy a copy still if I saw one in the store, and I enjoyed my time with it. But that's it. Those are all of the 5-star books from 2012. Past Sarah, I think, did a pretty good job of giving 5 stars to the books that truly earned them from my perspective. And what I mean by earned them, just like I explained at the beginning, means that they stuck with me in some way. I still think of them fondly. They're still very vibrant in my mind. I think about them from time to time. And I think most of the books on this list do meet those criteria. Probably not all of them, but definitely most of them. So I would love to hear from you guys. Do you remember the books that you gave 5 stars so many years ago? Do they still stick out for you? Are you a very over the top 5-star giver? Are you a 5-star strumpet, to quote Alan? Are you just throwing out 5 stars left, right, and center? Or are you a very reserved, 1 or 2 books per year might get a 5-star from me and I'm going to love them for the rest of my life? I would like to know, and hopefully this wasn't too long by the fact that I had to take a coughing break. I imagine when I go look at the timing, it's gonna be 40 minutes or something. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!